please tell them that I said so, that they need to appreciate you, because I really am I'm just so encouraged by your participation here today. So I think it would be nice for you to kind of get a sense of who I am. So as I mentioned, my name is Gower, and I serve at New Life Presbyterian Church in Fullerton. For those of you that are not from around here, Fullerton is just about like 10 minutes away. I have been a part of youth ministry for a good chunk of time. I was serving as our youth director for 6 years, and then prior to that, I served as just a lay volunteer for 4 years, and now I am counseling full-time at my church as a biblical counselor. Youth ministry is near and dear to my heart, because not only do I love that age group of middle school and high school students, but I actually do youth ministry at home all the time. I have 3 kids. I have a middle schooler, she's in 7th grade, and then I have a freshman in high school, and that's my middle son, and then my oldest daughter is a senior in high school and is ready to launch, which is so crazy to me. And so I love talking about teens, and I'm really excited for the opportunity to talk to you guys about teens. But in order for us to be able to do that, and in order for us to just really be able to do that well, we really do need God's guidance and His wisdom. So would you please join me in praying before we get started? Father, we thank you so much for this time of learning and this time of growing that you've given us today. Just through the day's activities, God, we're reminded that the encouragement and the edification that we receive really is from your generous hand. You are so good, and you are so gracious in giving us exactly what we need in order to grow in loving you and in loving your young people. So for the next hour, we're going to be discussing small groups and how they can serve as a really robust place for young people to grow in being known by you and in knowing you. God, in your word, you promise to be an ever-present help to us. So at this time, we just ask for your wisdom. Through our discussion, help us to see how we can be used as your instruments to make your love and care really vivid for our teens. And we pray this in your son's name. Amen. So throughout our time, and as you know with this conference, we are trying to bridge some gaps, right? We've been talking about the heart. And then now we're trying to bridge the gap from the heart to how do we move to the hands, which is like really like practical ministry. And then we're going to be talking about our head, which will be later on this afternoon. But as we talk about hands and what it means to effectively minister to young people in practical ways, we're going to talk about it specifically within the context of small group ministry. So here are the 3 things that we're going to be unpacking today. I decided to go with like an alliteration. I don't know why, it just ended up working that way. So there's these 3 P's that we're going to be covering. The first is the problem. And by problem, meaning that small group ministry is complex. We see a lot of potential, and then we also run into pitfalls with small group ministry, and then there's the issue of our perspective, the way we approach small group ministry. So we're going to be talking about those things. And then the next thing that we're going to talk about is the principle. Given the 3 P's that are up there in the first point, given those factors, what does it mean to have a operating principle that kind of undergirds our approach with small group ministry? And for us as Christians, it's always going to be following the way of Christ. But I would be doing a disservice to all of you if I said, okay, that's it, and then you just go and do ministry. We're going to actually unpack what we mean by what does it look like in its specificity to follow the way of Christ as youth leaders within the context of reaching our kids in small groups. And then finally, we're going to talk about the pursuit. And basically, with the pursuit, we want to be able to operationalize this principle of following the way of Christ. What does that look like in real time? And as youth leaders, we know that we're always trying to make our theology, the things that we confess and we believe about Jesus Christ, and we want to actually see it. We want to see it in daily life. And so what does it look like then, even in the way that you're serving? How do you pursue your students? How are you drawing them out? And we want to have practical tools. So hopefully you'll come away from today with at least one practical tool in your tool belt. So again, problem, principle, and pursuit are the things I want to discuss today. So the problem. And I would say that the problem with small groups and the complexity of it is that it is very rich with potential. And I'm just going to go ahead and talk about what that potential can look like. They bring the idea of community to life for us and for our teens. They help foster and establish connection, and they serve as a place for care. And we also see that students, when they have a place to go, something consistent like a small group, they really get that sense of belonging, right? Which is what all of us are looking for. And they help us carry out that call to actually build one another up to grow in the likeness of Christ. Really good things about small group ministry. But for all the good things about small group ministry, it really does present some challenges. Now, I'm going to set the scene for you guys. I'm going to flesh out these pitfalls for you, and then you just kind of tell me whether or not this sounds familiar. As a youth leader, every week you are spending a good chunk of time, and you are reading your Bible study passage, and you are planning and preparing, and then you're studying that book that you have for your topical study, and then what happens? You get there, and the discussions just fall flat. And it doesn't happen just occasionally. It may happen a lot more than you would like to admit. And I say this because I'm with you. This is born out of all of my frustrations with small group ministry and in all the ways that I stumbled as I was going through it. But that's real, right? It happens to us. And then to remedy this, we start to think, okay, I need to learn how to avoid those questions that lead to obvious answers. And I also need to avoid those questions that are going to produce like the one-word response, where they're like, yeah, bruh, or whatever, Sorry, that's like my son. My son is always like, no cap, bruh, whatever, and he would hate it that I'm actually using those words. But that's what happens, right? You don't get much. You're just like, okay, I'm going to avoid questions like that. So then we try really, really hard to come up with open-ended questions, right? And we get really good at it. We're like, let me go ahead and ask these open-ended questions that is going to encourage the kind of reflection and the kind of dialogue that we're hoping for in small group. But even then, you find that your conversations stall. You notice, right? And this always happens, like your students are like avoiding eye contact with you when you ask the question, and they think the more they look down, the more you won't notice that they're there. Or they do the thing where their eyes are darting back and forth. Do you see that? Where they're darting back and forth, or they're looking at their peer group, and they are just like telepathically trying to send that message like, you do it. No, you do it. You do it. And they are just hoping that someone will provide some relief. And that silence, I think especially as a youth leader, because you could tell it's awkward for them, but it's so awkward for us too, right? It feels deafening. It feels really uncomfortable. But because God is good, He sends His Spirit, and He just has the Spirit lead. And then there's that one student that shows God's mercy and then provides that one response. And then you're like, thank you, God, right? And that happens. And we're thankful. We're so thankful that there's that one student that's willing to take the risk of stepping in and giving that response. But here's the thing. Then we encounter another little snag in this. We start to see that our students, over time, even when they kind of get better at responding, they just track in generalities. It just kind of stays there. And I don't know about where all of you are from, and I don't want to make an assumption, but I'll speak about my context. At New Life, where I go to church, New Life Pres, we are a bunch of upper middle class people. And our teens live very suburban lives, right? So they are upper middle class Asian Americans. And because, the teens that we serve are basically like my kids' peer group, they're all at least third generation, right? And so they're not like butting up against the difficulties of living in an immigrant family. It's not any of those things. But what you'll notice that because they are Asian American, culturally, they still hold on to certain things. they are really good about hiding themselves and only talking about things that are acceptable. They like acceptable topics, like what's safe, right? And then they'll talk about, oh, I need God's help to not complain as I'm studying, right? Or they'll say, I really need to learn to trust in God's control over my grades and the looming college application season that's coming up. And I say this because I'm not trying to trivialize or minimize what it is that they're going through, because those are real things. Those are real things for our students. So I don't discount that level of self-disclosure, but I think what you start to recognize is that then it just stays there. It stays really safe. And then you start to realize that the sharing feels awfully one-dimensional, and it just feels really superficial, right? And so for all of the potential we see in small groups, we don't see discussions going deeper. And what you start to get a sense is that it's like as if all of your students are the same, which is a disservice to them in some ways, because you know that they're all individuals, right? But for some reason, they all seem to kind of share the same story. So then you don't get a sense as a leader, how are they actually being sanctified? What are they wrestling with? What are their sin issues? What are the hurts? What are those struggles? You don't know. And then over time, and I say this as a confession for me, I don't want to assume that this is you, but I know that over time, after a while, week after week, I just wanted to get by. I was like, okay, I'm going to study my passage. I'm going to have the questions. We're going to throw in some prayers for the week about the tests that they have. Check it off the list and let's go. But you don't really know them, right? You don't really know them, and it just feels stagnant. And so those are the things that we run into in youth ministry with small groups. And what I want to present to you and what I want to challenge all of us to think about is that the issue with the potential and the pitfalls might actually be a matter of our perspective. Now, when the best laid plans don't yield the outcomes that we hope, right? Small group can feel really discouraging. And then as the disappointment settles in, we actually become very vulnerable to the temptation of making assumptions about our kids. I'm going to say that again. When we get disappointment, actually becomes a battleground, and it becomes a temptation for us to make the wrong kinds of assumptions about our students. We start to interpret their silence as a sign of their lack of interest and their lack of care. And we think that they are not really particularly caring or interested in the material that you've prepared, or we assume that they are not interested in the group itself, or we start to take it personally and think that they're not interested in us, right? And then we start to do the thing where we dismiss them, where we say, oh, they're just checked out. These teens these days, they're just checked out. Or we start to actually lead to more cutting evaluations of them, where we count them as rude. And we think that they're closed off, and we think that they're resistant. And maybe you start to think, you know what, they're just a bad kid. They're just bad seeds. They're disobedient and they're disrespectful. And that's not where we want to be, because when we look at one another, and as I look at you and as you look at me, we're all supposed to see each other as image bearers, right? And so instead of seeing the evidence of God's grace in them, all we see are the things that we can criticize about our students without even really knowing them that well. And I say this while also wanting to recognize how important it is to have a plan and an agenda for your small groups. I'm not saying that your preparation is in vain. Preparation is good. We are to guard the time, and the time is meant to be purposeful, right? But I think it would be helpful for all of us to really reflect on whether or not we hold a little too tightly to our plans each week. And when we hold a little bit too tightly to making sure that the plan goes according to the way we've planned, what we might end up doing unwittingly is actually missing valuable, very valuable opportunities for you to get to know your students in a really meaningful way. And the way for us to do that is when you take the time to actually slow down, like to slow things really down. I know that, and I say this as someone who used to create pacing plans for my youth ministry so that our teachers would know week by week, this is what you're hitting. And so follow the pacing plan. You have a ministry year, it starts from September and goes through the end of June. Follow the plan, right? But I think sometimes we hold a little bit too tightly to that. And then we miss the opportunity to slow things down with our students and to actually ask whether or not our approach invites students to consider how Christ is actually relevant to them personally. And I think that what we don't recognize a lot of the times is that the very best of intentions and the expectations that we have for discussion actually work against what we're trying to achieve. And so this is what happens with small group. We expect our students to come ready. We expect them as young people to sit down and have a sustained conversation, right? And then we expect them to actually be interested in the topics that we've prepared and to do it organically. We're like, yeah, organically talk about this, right? And then we also presume that the questions we've created and the material that we vetted is actually going to be engaging for them, right? In the same way that it is for us. We're like, why wouldn't you want to talk about redemption, or God's mercy? But I think when we presume in that way, what we negate is the fact that our kids are still developing. They're still maturing. We forget that they're maturing in every way. They're maturing physically, they're maturing emotionally, cognitively, socially, and yes, they are maturing still spiritually. And what I have found is that when we really kind of get in just like a certain kind of groove with youth ministry, where we kind of get set in our ways, we start to forget that even though we know intellectually that they are young, we forget that they are young. Does that make sense? And so even though we know intellectually they're still growing and that they're still young people, what we do is we try to go about helping them foster a relationship with the Lord and with one another as we would do with adults. And we forget that teens are not quite ready to have the kinds of discussions that we are expecting with an adult vocabulary and to be able to have it in a sophisticated way. And so this is what happens when we lead with our own perspective. When we start to think that from the way that we think discussion should go and the way that we want our students to engage, when we come from our perspective and we don't try to make the effort to see it through their eyes, we fall short in knowing and in understanding and in loving the young people that God has placed in our care. Which then leads us to the principle, right? So what does it look like to know and love our students well, as God intends? So I mentioned before when we first started that we're going to make following the way of Christ our operating principle. And what does that mean, right? What does that actually look like concretely? And you know what, guys? What's so great is that God is so merciful that he's actually given us a way. He really has. And it's in Philippians 2, 5-8, which is a passage that I think many of us are familiar with, but I would like for us to read it together. And it says this: "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." So when we default to simply trying harder to making our plans stick in the way that we want it to, this clues us in to the ways in which we might actually be thinking about our own interests more than the interests of our students. When we live out of the reality of Ephesians 2, 5-8, we are living out of the reality that you and I are united to Christ. And because you and I are united to Christ, that means we actually have the mind of Christ. And the mind of Christ, which actually is ours, gospel reality is ours, then that means that we can live as Christ lived. we can actually embody his very humility. When we look at these verses, we remember that Christ did not count equality with God something to be grasped, right? But what he does is that he sees our need, he sees it fully. And in knowing that our sinful condition can actually, not at all in any way allow us to merit our favor with the Lord, what he does is he actually draws us nearer to himself. He does it himself. So what does he do, right? How did he actually do this? Well, in Jesus, we see that he doesn't expect us to ascend to him. He actually descends to us, right? He meets us where we are. And this is where I think, and this is why I love biblical counseling, because biblical counseling is all about how is it that the richness of the truth of God actually meets us at the street level. And we see that God is all about meeting us where life happens all the time. It doesn't stay up here. It's not heady intellectual stuff. It's like real stuff every single day. And Jesus shows it in like full, I almost said Technicolor, but that's like old. Like what is, like the high definition stuff. It's real, right? And so what he does is he does it and he meets us. He sees where we are. He enters into our world and he experiences life just like you and I experience life day to day. And that's the very kind of approach that we want to have with our teens. There's this man named Ed Welch. He's actually one of my former professors. He is an author and a counselor at the Christian Counseling and Educational Foundation. And he's written this great book. I encourage you to read it. It's called Caring for One Another. And in this book, he captures how Jesus actually challenges all of our expectations. And what Jesus does is that he actually inverts all of our worldly values in the ways that he meets us. And he writes this: kings receive people. They consent to give you a 5-minute audience, then off you go. Kings do not show up at your home or go out of their way to help you. But everything changes when King Jesus comes. This king leaves the palace precincts and finds you. Right? This is how God invaded our world. He didn't expect you to ascend to him. He finds you. He pursues you. And that's what we want to embody with our teens. This is a profound gospel reality. In Jesus, we see that the way of our king is not that he doesn't demand that we fall in line, right? He doesn't say that we have to work our way to get to know him. Instead, the way of King Jesus is to see and to know our struggle with sin and suffering. And then what does he do? He doesn't lord it over you. He says, I am going to pursue you with all gentleness, with all patience, and with all love, right? And we see that the way Jesus does it is that he doesn't do it from afar. He takes great measures to meet you where you are. He takes on flesh. The Word became flesh. He does that for you and for me, so that he could actually understand what it's like to be human in every way and yet to be tempted in every way but not sin. So because Jesus meets us exactly where we are, the way of Jesus becomes our method and the way that we approach small group. By and through the love of Christ and the humility of Christ, we aim to pursue our young people, and we embody the very pursuit of Christ in the way that we minister to them. So the pursuit, how to draw out our teens. I am all about, especially in counseling, we want to make our confessional theology concrete, right? We want to be very practical. And so if we want to be practical with our students, we want the truth of God's word to actually have impact in their lives and actually transform their lives, right? So then what that means is that since our King Jesus, pursues, as people of the King, wherever he goes and whatever he does, we do likewise. Okay? And what does that mean? Well, what Jesus does is that he does Proverbs 20, verse 5. The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. That means that behind the silence of small group that happens, behind the awkward glances and the avoiding of eye contact, or the perhaps seeming lack of interest and the potentially rude behavior, we have students whose hearts are active because we live coram deo, before the face of God. They have active hearts, just like you and I have active hearts, right? Their hearts are constantly feeling, choosing, desiring, and longing. And so how do we then draw those things out? How do we draw out the deep purposes, the deep waters of their heart? Ephesians 4, 1-3 gives us a model for how to do that. And this is the Apostle Paul speaking. He says, I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And the reason, friends, that this actually becomes our method is because if you have been met by your Savior, and I don't know everyone's stories, but I know that all of you have one, you know that Jesus has met you in these specific ways. He has been humble and patient with you. He has been incredibly gentle with you. He bears with you in love. And he's eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, meaning that he unites you to himself, right? We want to be able to do the same in the way that we approach our teens. And so, as youth ministry leaders, as we are trying to point our students to Christ, we want them to grow in the likeness of our King. And so we enter into their stories just as Ephesians 4 calls us to. We aim to be that man of understanding, right, in Proverbs 20, and we draw out their purposes just as Jesus does with us. And in practice, this means that we work really hard to get to know our teens, right? We can't just expect things to happen. We have to work hard to know them, and we want to know them developmentally, and we want to know them individually. Now, I know that I am in a room full of youth leaders. I don't know where everyone's experience is, but I imagine that all of us have a fairly decent grasp of what teens are like. And if you are new to youth ministry, welcome. We're so glad to have you. But if you're new to it, that's okay, because maybe you watched Inside Out 1 and 2, and you watched Turning Red, and you're like, yeah, I kind of know. I kind of get what's going on with teens when they're going through all of the changes, right? But to winsomely and to effectively draw out our teens so that they actually feel seen and known, we have to know what life is actually like for them. And one helpful way to do that is to enter in by knowing where they are developmentally. So as one of your handouts, I've actually given you a developmental chart. And it's two-sided, right? The developmental chart? Okay. So on one side, you have the early stage of adolescence, which is ages 11 through 13. And then on the other side, you should see middle adolescence, which is 14 through 18. And this is something that I've adapted from the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and from the book, it's called Building Bridges by Julie Lowe. And Julie Lowe is a licensed counselor, but she actually used to work at CCEF as a counselor, and she writes a lot of books on how parents and youth leaders and churches can actually bring a biblical worldview for our young people, right? And so I'm going to start with those early adolescent years, 11 through 13, our wonderful middle schoolers. How many of you guys actually teach middle schoolers? I love middle school. That's where I was an middle school English teacher, and so middle school is my jam. I know they're a little bit awkward, but we love them, right? And this is why they're awkward, guys. We have to know them developmentally. I'm not going to read all of this, but I do think it's helpful for us to kind of pay attention to what's happening to our middle schoolers. There's a lot of things happening physically. Right? They're like growing, they're eating a lot, and some of them, they're actually finally like refining those motor skills, so their handwriting is much more well established. And because their bodies are changing so much, socially and emotionally, they feel really awkward about themselves. Have you ever had that student that just suddenly in one summer grew like 5 inches? It's a lot, and then maybe they still are a little bit too much arms and legs, and the kids are like, oh, you're so arms and legs, it's just, there's so much happening. And then we start to see that cognitively, there's a growing capacity for abstract thought, right? But because they're still growing, when you're talking about things that can happen in the future, that does not resonate with them because they're much more present oriented, right? They don't have the capacity just yet to really think long term. But there is deeper moral thinking. So you can challenge their thinking. So it's that in-between stage. You also see that they have a desire for greater autonomy, but they're also much more interested in their friends for the first time rather than their own families. And this is when parents start to see that because there's greater conflict with parents and their children, right? And they also start to realize, hey, my parents give a lot of rules, but they're not actually perfect. And so that's a new thing for them too, because they're actually starting to see that their parents are human, right? And then there's moodiness. There's a greater interest in like, oh, this is like my room. It's my computer, my phone, all of those things. So there's this greater interest in privacy. But we also see that spiritually, they're starting to realize a lot of things. They recognize that there are influences and motives that actually undergird their choices and their actions, that they can actually choose to sin. Right? And we also see that they, may realize that it's hard to think about what to do when you're sinned against, right? They don't know what to do in that kind of complexity. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with this. They may have a really difficult time when you go, hi, Joe, why don't you pray for us before we start? And they're like, oh my gosh, I want to die. That's why they're silent, because they don't want to do stuff like that. And they haven't learned it yet. They don't know how to do it, right? But what that means for us is that it's a rich opportunity to teach them how. Okay, so this is why I want to show us what developmentally is happening with our students, because I think it helps us understand, okay, there are some things where they need to grow in knowing how to do certain things. Maybe abstract thought and conceptual thought is a little bit too difficult right now for them to grasp, and then you show them much more grace, right? Much more grace. And then we have our high school students, those middle adolescent years. For girls, puberty is pretty much done, but then for boys, they're still growing, right? So there's a lot going on there. We see that they're starting to understand that there are consequences for future behavior. So there is this more forward-thinking, development that we're seeing. And then because they're able to have forward-thinking thoughts, they're actually able to set goals for themselves and think about, what do I want like 5 years from now, for example. They're interested in moral reasoning and thinking about life. But also, and we love our high schoolers, but they can be a little bit self-involved. Life is kind of like the world is about what's going on with them. And then there's also this continued desire for autonomy. They want to be more independent from their parents. And then they also have a greater, just like attachment to their friends. And then we also start to see spiritually that they need to learn how to deal with peer pressure and issues of addiction, sexuality, and suicide. I want to particularly highlight those things because I think what we forget sometimes is that our high school students are dealing with a lot of heavy things. If they are not themselves dealing with these things, they definitely know someone who is, right? They'll have a friend who's vaping a lot and drinking a lot. They'll have a friend who's starting to cut and self-harm and maybe threaten suicide. They're also, having friends that are exploring their sexuality or perhaps very active, right? And so when you have students that are going through something like this, one, I think we know it's happening, and so we're like, okay, it's happening. But what I want to be able to highlight is that it's happening for them for the very first time. That's a lot, right? If you just kind of know it conceptually, but then you start to see that your friends are wrestling with this and that maybe you yourself are, and it's for the first time, they don't know what to do with all of that. So there's a lot of thoughts, but they don't necessarily know how to express it. Again, another opportunity for you to say, how can I then enter in so that they can talk about these things? And then, they start to understand that corporate worship and church attendance is actually critical to shaping their values and forming a personal relationship with Christ. And this is when, with our high school students, we start to see a little bit more ownership, right? And wanting to understand and wrestle with their faith. But you'll also see that they're still expressing some discomfort in praying, those kinds of spiritual things that they may not be ready for. So I think why this is so helpful for us is that, like for a middle school student, let's say that you're going through a study in your small group and you're talking about God's plans to one day renew and restore all things. Very future oriented, right? And then when you're wondering why it is that they're struggling to answer your questions, it's because they are possibly not ready to actually kind of like grasp that and think that. And I'm not saying and discouraging you from talking about that, because we do need to talk about those things. It's God's word, right? Those are God's truths. We want to talk about them. But we want to maybe calibrate our expectations a little bit so that we understand if they don't quite get it, it's a way to keep talking to them about it, to plant the seed and knowing that God is the one who waters and grows and that there can be fruit later on, but according to God's timing, not necessarily ours. And then with a high schooler, we see this greater autonomy or desire for autonomy, and that can actually lead to a lot of conflict for our high school students, right, with their parents. And so with that, I think that's an opening for us to actually talk about the challenges in relationships and to say, okay, what is it that God is doing in conflict? And what is it that he's trying to teach you about himself and about yourself and how you can actually learn to love others, right? Even in the midst of something that is hard. So we want to be able to bring these things out of their hearts. Developmentally, we see that it is ripe with those kinds of things. And I say this because I think a lot of times we know that about them, but we expect our students to talk about it effortlessly. And then when we think that maybe they just lack insight or perhaps they're not very self-aware, what we forget is that developmentally they may just not be ready. They just may not be ready. However, like with anything that's like a developmental chart, I say use this loosely. It is not fixed. Some kids are going to be more mature than others. Some kids are going to be a little less developed than others. But why I think this is helpful as an aid is that it kind of gives you a little bit of a gauge. And so, for example, if you have a high school student who actually has a harder time with abstract thought, right, and certain kinds of questions, it allows you to be a lot more sensitive in saying, okay, then what is it like for that student that is being drilled with questions that feel really hard for them and they don't know how to deal with it at school? That can be a very big challenge for someone that has to deal with that day in and day out. And when you're sensitive to those things, that allows you to move towards them with greater sensitivity to actually find out, what is that like for you, right? And so what we want to do is use these charts as a way to accurately understand how our students may be interpreting their world day in and day out. So as we know them developmentally, that knowledge can actually inform how we draw out those individual stories. And one of the ways to do that, to facilitate sharing and reflection, is something that we call expressive activities. Now, expressive activities, and I want to preface this, it does come from the play therapy field. But because I'm a biblical counselor, I'm not advocating secular approaches to making meaning in our students' lives. However, I do think that expressive activities are a great common grace tool. It's a common grace tool in the sense that it helps us in becoming more wise in using different kinds of tools and activities redemptively. Right? And that's what we're after. We want to use these things redemptively. And it provides a really creative avenue for expressing thoughts and for expressing experiences that otherwise may prove really, really difficult in communicating and in articulating for someone who's 11 through 18 years old. And so what I think, when expressive activities are used really well, I think that they highlight our students' strengths and abilities, and it actually encourages them to open up. I think activities that are used well kind of help organize information for students and for you too. And you do it in manageable chunks. I think sometimes with open-ended questions, what can happen too is just that it can feel too big for a 13-year-old. They're like, you literally asked me 3 questions in 1 question, and they just don't know where to go with that, right? And so a lot of times that just shuts them down because they just don't know how to approach it. And what an expressive activity does is that it helps you actually slow down. When I was talking about slowing things down with your students, you do it one step at a time. And you do it patiently and you do it gently with them so that you're meeting them exactly where they are. And so it helps us collect and organize and visualize their thoughts, desires, and circumstances. And it really helps become an entry point for you to enter into their lives, and not just enter into their experience, but allows you to then help them reinterpret it through a gospel lens. Because I think a lot of times what happens is when they don't realize that God is sovereign and ordaining all things, it just becomes about you and your world gets very small. But what we want to do with these expressive activities is to, one, be vulnerable before the Lord because we live in the presence of God, and then to remind them that what the gospel does is it reclaims your story. God enters in and then he restories it to make your story his story. And that's what we want to do every time when we're talking with our kids. And I know it's not always going to be successful, but that's the approach that we want to have every time we're meeting with our kids. So I think it would be helpful. I know that I'm talking about this and I don't want it to stay in the realm of theoretical. Because again, what we're trying to do is we want to make our theology concrete. Right? And so I think one of the things that might actually be helpful for us, and this is actually one of my go-to expressive activities with students, and it's called the relational assessment. And it's an activity that I've taken out from Julie Lowe's book, Building Bridges. And so I think as you're thinking about that developmental chart, we know that both for the early adolescent years as well as for the middle adolescent years, peer groups become much more influential, right? And there's this increasing reliance on friends and therefore their approval. And then on top of that, especially as they get older, they're not just looking to their parents as role models anymore. I think I'm looking at quite a few role models in the room. Some of you might be your students' role models, and then there's other people that are speaking into their lives. But we want to get a sense of like who's influencing them. Who's influencing them, and not only that, maybe there's some relationships that are really hard that they're struggling with, and they just don't know how to talk about those things. And the reason why we want to, I like to start with relationships with students is because I think it's ripe for gospel, just proclaiming the gospel to them. Because it helps, relationships are being interpreted, they make meaning from relationships. Some relationships might be used as a way of idolatry, where they may be idolizing certain relationships over their relationship with the Lord, or some relationships may actually be damaging, where they're saying like, oh, this person doesn't approve of me, therefore I have made an interpretation of myself and my world. And this is just drawing all of those things out. You just want to get a sense of like, okay, what is my students' world like? What is it that they're grappling with? And how do I get a sense of this? Is one way to organize it is in this way. And I think this is so helpful for a small group discussion, because I think what it does is that it actually, as you guide them through, they're the ones filling it out. And then if you have already established trust in your small group, it's a way in for them to be a little bit more vulnerable about what's going on, and they get to share with their peer group, and they're sharing with you as well. So I would love for us to actually do this, because I think when we want to implement things with our students, it is most helpful for us to know what it feels like for us, so that we know what it might feel like for them. So if you can turn to that blank side of your handout. And I want to model for all of you how we can do this with our teens. So I want to model for you that each step should be said one step at a time, because that is, and I think even for adults, right? I know that when people spit at me like 5 different instructions, I'm just like, okay, what's priority? I don't know. So we slow it down. We move with gentleness and patience and humility, and we do one step at a time. And then as we do one step at a time, we want to sit and we want to observe and we want to listen really well for our students. And so it's really just meeting them where they are and giving them your attention and really trying to kind of become experts of the students that you serve. You want to know them well. And the reason why we want to know them well is because Jesus knows us so well. And he says that that is how we want to know one another within the context of gospel community. So we just want to mimic God's kingdom as much as we can. If that is the culture of God's house, let's go ahead and live out that culture in our own local churches. Okay, what I want to kind of point you to is that we're going to start from the center and then we're going to work our way out, okay? So I want you to think about all the people that are in your life. Just kind of generally, think about them, get a picture of them in your head. And what I want you to do is that as you're thinking about them and as you're thinking about yourself too, put your name, the name that people call you, put it down in the center of the box. The name that people call you. Go ahead and write that down in the center of the box. And then we're going to move on to box 2, which is just the one outside of the center box. Who do you feel closest to? Who do you feel closest to? Go ahead and write those names. Who do you feel closest to?
Are you writing one name per box? Or?
You can write as many names as you would like per box. And if you can kindly look up so that I know that you're ready for the next one once you are done. Thank you. Okay. Now for the third box, write down the people you like, the people that you enjoy being with, but you don't feel quite as close to. What are their names? So the people that you like and you enjoy being with them, but you don't feel quite as close to them. Write down those names. Okay. I know it seems like I'm being impatient, but I'm just looking at the time. But for box 4, write down the names of people who are a big part of your life, but you just don't feel as close to them. So they're a big part of your life, but you don't feel as close to them. Go ahead and write down those names. Okay, are we ready for box 5? Yeah? Okay. And then in box 5, write down the names of the people who are a big part of your life, but you may not like them or you have a hard time getting along with them. And these might be people that may have hurt you or they kind of have frightened you. So these are people that are a big part of your life, but you don't really like them or you have a hard time getting along with them. Write those people down in box 5. Okay. Now, as you're looking at the names that you've written, of all of those names, who do you go to when you need help? Circle the names of the people that you go to when you need help. And then as you're still looking at your chart, who do you spend the most time with? Underline those names. Underline the names of the people that you spend the most time with. And then put a star next to all the people you like the best. All the people you like the best on that chart, go ahead and put a star next to their names. I see a lot of stars. It means that you guys have good people in your life. Okay, now this next one. Out of everyone you've listed on your chart, who do you think likes you best? Put a triangle around the name of the person that you think likes you best. Okay, and then who are the people that you have a hard time getting along with, the ones that you struggle with? Put a box around those names. And then lastly, as you're looking at this chart, where would you put God? Where does God go? Okay. What did you guys think? What are some things that you've noticed about working through this activity? And I want you to think about your students if they were to do this. What are some things that you think would actually be helpful for you, even as as they're writing things down and as you're learning? What do you think that you would end up finding out about them? Yeah.
Maybe like the relationship with their parents.
Yeah, yeah. What I love about that question of like the person who is a big part of your life, right? And like the people that you're closest to, because what I've seen with students, what they'll do is that they'll recognize some of the people that they're closest to are their family, but it's also the same people that they struggle the most with, you know? So then depending on the way they're marking up their paper, you'll get a sense of that, of the dynamic that is happening at home. And sometimes what you'll notice with middle school students, if they're maybe a little bit more delayed, or maybe even not delayed, I think it's just a matter of how they're interpreting their world. When you're asking who is closest to you, sometimes they'll literally write the people that are physically closest to them, not necessarily emotionally close to them. Does that make sense? So then that kind of clues you in on like, oh, and then you ask, why did you write that person? They're like, oh, well, they like sit right next to me in class and drive me crazy. And you're like, oh, so they're talking about physical proximity. They're not necessarily talking about the heart. But it helps you understand, okay, this is how they're making meaning of their world, right? What else are you thinking as you were working through it? How do you think this would be helpful within the context of kind of understanding the way our students are relating in relationships? Yeah.
Like knowing who their network is, or like where they feel safe.
Yeah, for sure. Because and the thing is, let's say their network, as you were saying, are people within the church. Then you start to see, oh, okay, this is how we can build out community for this person. Who are the people that they're actually going to? And if it's not, and if it's like more friends, and then you want to know, okay, like there's a lot of power and influence in some of these friend groups. What is it that these friend groups are kind of teaching them about life, and how are they speaking into that, or are they actually being spoken to, and to be able to get a sense of that as well. I would say that what's so helpful about this too is that with like the triangles and the underlining and the circling, it organizes visually for your teen how to talk about each thing. Because when you just go, tell me about your friends, they're like, there's like a lot going on, or tell me what social life is like at school. And they're like, holy cow. There's a lot happening, so they may not even know where to start. When you organize this in this way, it makes it much more manageable for them too. And I think what you'll find is that even for our students, they're like, oh, I hadn't really thought about these friendships in this way before. And it actually feels kind of insightful for them. And I think especially for those, when we say, where is God in this? They're like, oh my gosh, I never wrote down God at all. And it kind of gives you a sense of how they actually relate to the Lord. If God is very far off, he's a big part of their lives, let's say, but maybe not necessarily someone they feel close to. And if God feels like someone that they struggle with, then you get a real deeper understanding of how they are relationally with Christ, right? And so it's just helpful. It's just a tool. It's not going to be the end-all, be-all solution, but it's definitely a way in talking with your teens. The next item that I want to direct your attention to, and this is just the instructions on the back for you to be able to work through it. And what before I move on to the next thing, what I like and appreciate about all the colors on this is that I really actually think that students like it when I bring like color pencils and markers and stuff, even when they're middle school or high school. They're like, cool, color, it's just, because it's a little different. Because I think when we're just coming in with packets or a book, and especially like our young people, actually a lot of people are really young in this room too, so I might be dating myself again. But like reading is really hard. And I say this because my kids went from loving reading to absolutely hating it, and they will not pick up a book. But I think what it is because there's reading assigned for school. They're just reading certain things. And so when we're like coming into church and we're just saying, hey, read the Bible, it's a hard sell. But I think there's still ways to do that, but we can do it in a way where we can go back to things that like bring a little bit of joy. And I say this because my 17-year-old actually loves to draw and color on her own time as a way to decompress. And so even in the ways that if you were to bring something that's like colored pencils or colored pens, and it just kind of brings a little life to them, you see a different side of them, And so this is the listening, the observing, taking the time to get to know students and what it is that they gravitate towards. Another thing, I know that it was like incredibly silent when we were working on the relational assessment together, but what I like to do is I'll just tell my students, I'm going to play music while we're doing this, and I'm going to call it out. And that can actually work really well for them too, especially for high school students. Another thing that may work as an expressive activity, I feel like middle school students, sometimes they haven't really developed a taste for music quite yet. Like they don't really know what their playlist should be other than all Taylor Swift. They're just like, oh, I only listen to Taylor Swift. So they may not have that kind of diverse, set of tastes just yet. But with high school students, they have all sorts of things on their playlist. And I think what might be helpful even as an emotions activity is to be able to say, okay, name your top 6 emotions, and you can have an emotions chart for them so that they can like start naming it if they have a hard time. And the top 6 emotions that you wrestle with kind of on a regular basis, and they write it down. And then what you can do is you can ask them, okay, what are the songs that are associated with each emotion? And if they're listening to like Kendrick, you know, and then you're like, wow, this is like a lot. Like, you know, this is like a lot of cursing going on and there's a lot of anger. And they're like, oh, that's the music that I listen to when I'm angry. It just kind of gives you a sense of what it is that they're imbibing, you know what I mean? And what it is that they're consuming. And then you can start to think, okay, when you're angry though, what is it that you're angry about? And why is it that this song latches onto you? I think that might even be the better question. Why this song? What is it about these words? And they can start talking to that a little bit. And then from there, you can go even deeper and say, okay, well, a lot of times our anger is about something even deeper than that. Sinful anger is usually about something where we are fearful of losing something that we desperately want, right? Or it's the potential, something that we want that's at risk, or it's the lack of control, and when we want control, it comes out in sinful anger. So those are the things that we can start latching onto for them. But I found that music in particular is very helpful, you know, not as a way to judge them, but as a way to open them up and get to know them more. Another activity is this activity called Walk in My Shoes. And I've actually done this myself too. And what's helpful is that you do it with your students and then you say, okay, especially for high school students. I would say middle school students, sometimes they don't know how to articulate everything just yet verbally, unless they're like 8th grade. But I would say from 8th grade to seniors, what you can do is you can say, okay, what is daily life like for you? And I would say that in my particular context at our church, our students are overscheduled. They are overscheduled. They go from 0 period to 6 period, and then from there they have their activities, and then by the time they come home to shower and to eat, then they're working. They take a weird nap from like 8 to 9, and then they're up from 9 to 1, and then they just rinse and repeat. And so they have all these pressures, and they may just shut down rather than talk about it. And what we want to do with this one is say, I want to know what it's like to actually live the life that you live. Tell me what it's like. I'm going to play some music, and you can, whether it's symbols or words and sentences or bullet points, just write it down. What's it like for you to live a day in your life? What do you want people to know about you that they may not necessarily know because you don't express it to them? And so that's the way that we can enter in with this one. And I would say Walk in My Shoes is particularly helpful for students that have been bullied, or perhaps students that are wrestling with feeling like they just don't quite fit at school. This past Sunday, our senior pastor gave a sermon on Revelation 21, right? And how one day God will wipe away all of our tears, and there will be, there's going to be, all things are new, right? New heavens and a new earth. And as a part of our sermon discussion, because we're doing sermon discussion for Sunday school with our youth students, I asked my group, so what are the things that make you sigh, right? What are the things that feel hard and just make you sigh and long for new heavens and a new earth? And one of our sophomores said, the thing that makes me sigh is that when I go to school, I am called racial slurs and I feel like an exile. And I was like, whoa, it just felt so deep in that moment. And I know him. He and I live in the same community, and we live in a community where there are very few Asians, and racial slurs are actually something that is kind of commonplace. And I so appreciated him going there. But if I could redo that sermon discussion, I would have loved to have had this activity and say, what is it like for you each day when you are just expecting someone to throw out something that's demeaning to you? And write that down, because the students were like, oh yeah, I resonate with that. That happens to me too. And it's just a way for them to organize it themselves, write it down in their own words. And then with having that in front of them, then they can go ahead and share it out. And then from there, as they share, how can you say that Christ knows what it's like to be exiled, because he was exiled and he was rejected and humiliated, and to know that you have a Savior who understands that. how can you then take everything you've written and actually engage the Lord with it? And how can I pray for you? How can I pray with you? And how can you be praying about this? Right? So it takes the very things that they struggle with and actually gives them a way to engage the Lord and to entrust those things to him. So as we wrap up, our goal, right, was to learn how can we meet our students where they are and to know them well so that they can understand themselves and understand their world. But I would say that our goal is for them to understand themselves and understand their world and to know what it's like to see it through God's eyes. And that's what we want to be able to help them do. And there are so many tools, and I would say that in all likelihood, you can make up your own activities. It does not have to be things that come out of the book, although the book is very helpful. I would say Building Bridges is very helpful. But you can just make up things as you go. And this is where I want to encourage you. Use your own creativity to figure out, okay, I know my students. I know them well enough to know what may jibe with them. What can I bring in then that they can latch onto that actually will help them draw them out more? And when you are accessing that kind of creativity, you're actually doing what Jesus did, is taking great measures to meet them where they are. And so I guess to conclude, it's just that I hope that as we meet them where they are, my prayer is that you would see that loving them in this very intentional sort of way actually reflects the very heart of our Good Shepherd, who actually pursues each of us one at a time. And so that's it. That's all I've got for today. Do you have any questions? We still have some time. We have like 9 minutes until our session's over. I'd be happy to take your questions about what it is that we've discussed for today. Yeah.
What else can you find kind of like, what is it?
Expressive activities, yeah. So these are the resources that I would recommend. So Building Bridges, which is Biblical Counseling Activities for Children and Teens by Julie Lowe. It is chock full of activities. And what I've done is I've taken her activities and I've actually just like modified it for my own use. And that was why I appreciated Hanley's message this morning where he's like, we're always contextualizing, right? And so I don't want you to just take these things for face value and go, okay, it's going to work because I'm using it. Instead, you can always tweak it. Like even that emotions one I talked about with the playlist, the emotions activity is actually in her book, but she doesn't use a playlist. She just used colors. The playlist was me because my kids are always like saying, oh, this is the playlist I listen to when I'm sad, and this is the playlist I listen to when I'm pumped up. And they like categorize it. And I realized, wow, playlists are so telling because it tells me what it is that the kind of ideas that they're latching onto. The things that they are actually maybe kind of passively consuming without ever really taking into consideration how it influences them and impacts them. And so, you can just take what it is that you know about your teens and then just connect it to something, and modify as you go. But that book is also helpful. Caring for One Another is like a really thin book by Ed Welch, and it's meant actually to be for like adults to read out loud together in a small group because the chapters are so short. I love Ed. He's so good. He just has this way of wanting to speak to adults as you would a child to make the truth of who we know God to be just very real and very simple, because when you know it simply, you know it better. And he does that really well with this book. And then the stages of adolescent development, I just kind of took from different places and just kind of created that chart. Any other questions? Well, I also, if you don't, or if you're too shy about asking questions right now, I'm nearby. I'm just like, my church is like just down the way. You're welcome to email me. I'd be happy to talk with you about things, about, the kingdom work that God is doing in your churches. And and thank you so much for joining me today, and enjoy the rest of your day.